touch my shoulder, it would touch my hair.
Starts now.
And I said, what the hell is that?
Spirits and More Radio starts now.
Welcome to the second show of Spirits and More Radio, everybody. This is the show where we talk about everything paranormal. Remember, this is a live broadcast, so you can call in at 1-872-2-GHOSTS. That's 1-872-244-6787.
Turn down the lights, if you dare. Spirits and More Radio.
Welcome to the show, everyone. On this show, we're joined by a gentleman who was a ghost tour guide and conducted seances for over a decade. He is definitely no stranger to the paranormal. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Paul Voodini to the show. Paul, it's about 11 p.m. there in Sheffield. I'd imagine the spirits are just waking up.
That's right. It's a nice dark night, mist rolling in off the moors, so the perfect evening to talk about ghosts and spirits and associated subjects. Right.
Now, you did do ghost tours for over a decade, but before we get into that, I did want to ask you, could you tell us what was your first paranormal experience that you can recall?
Oh, well, my interest in the paranormal goes way back to childhood. I was always obsessed by ghosts, UFOs, anything unexplained or unexpected that would take me out of my very sort of ordered and humdrum existence. I lived in the suburbs, had a very ordinary upbringing, went to a very ordinary school, and so the paranormal and the supernatural was an escape route for me to think that there was greater wonder out there in the world and in the universe, and there was more going on than sort of met the eye. So trying to think of the very first paranormal experience I had, to be honest with you, the first one I had before I started working in the paranormal world and in the paranormal ghost hunting industry was when I saw an object in the sky, a flaming object that may or may not have been a comet or a meteor, but it was definitely an unidentified flying object that I saw flying over the sky. Totally blew my mind. It was a really awe-inspiring moment for me and something I'll never forget. So although I went into the ghost industry doing seances and ghost hunts, my very first paranormal event was actually more to do with UFOs.
Right. And I can say from my experience, it wasn't until I was about 25 years old that I first had something happen to me that was defied logic and understanding. So I know for some people it's a once-in-a-lifetime event, and for others it happens more frequently. So with these ghost tours, what part of England were you conducting the ghost tours in?
I worked all over the UK. I worked at several venues in York, which I'm sure you've heard of, often referred to as the most haunted city in the UK. I was lucky enough to work at places such as Oxford Castle, which is a wonderful location, a place called the Galleries of Justice in Nottingham, which is an old courthouse, an old jail, and an old workhouse. Also a place called Alton Towers, which is probably the UK's biggest theme park. So if you can think of Disneyland or Universal theme park, a very similar kind of setup. But what very few people realize is in the center of the theme park, there is an old stately home, the original Alton Towers, that is this ruined stately home that is probably the most Gothic and spooky place I've ever visited in my life. So I've been very lucky to work at some of the most haunted locations, for want of a better phrase, in the UK.
Wow, that sounds interesting. So that home that you speak of at Alton Towers was something that had just been preserved over the years. Is there a particular story associated with that area that sort of draws in the paranormal crowd?
There's a legend to do with the original owners of Alton Towers, and by Alton Towers I'm referring to the stately home and not the theme park that has been built up around it. And the legend is that there was an old oak tree in the centre of the grounds, and the owners, the master of Alton Towers, was a bit of a bad man. He was a mean guy, and he upset a local witch. And she said that there would be if a branch fell off the old oak tree, then there would be a curse upon the family, and death would rain down upon the family. And so this tree was preserved. It had chains wrapped around it in an attempt to make sure that no limbs fell from this tree, no branches fell from the tree, in order to avert the witch's curse. And that oak tree is still there now, and it's supported by wooden scaffolding, really, to keep it up, because it's a really, really ancient tree.
Wow.
And so that's the legend that is based around Alton Towers, and that does bring in the sort of paranormal investigators to investigate. And as I said, it's a very, very gothic place.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. Here in San Diego, where I'm located, there's a famous house dubbed the most haunted house in California or America, called the Whaley House. And right in front of that house is a large old tree. And they've, through records, been able to determine that that is where they would hang people based on, breaking the law and so forth. So there's quite a few people that come to visit that tree and gather around. I would imagine it's the same over there. So for your ghost walk tours, there may be some people who have never experienced a ghost walking tour. I've been on one in San Antonio. Maybe you could just sort of describe how that goes and what people see and experience.
Sure. Well, I worked for several companies in the UK over a number of years, and they used to run ghost hunting evenings. So the idea was that they would hire out the castle or the stately home or the haunted hotel, and they would employ a medium whose job was to hold seances later on in the evening. My job was to be the host and to do a history tour of the location. So when the guests first arrived, I would take them on a tour of the building and of the grounds, relaying to them the local legends, the stories of the building, and also some of the ghost stories associated with the building. And then later on in the evening, they would be introduced to the medium, who would then take them on a walk around the location. From their viewpoint, what they would be doing will be to point out what they could pick up with their mediumship, with their psychic abilities. So they would say, there's a spirit of a gentleman over here, there's a spirit of a gentleman over there, I'm picking up upset and distress in this corner of this room, etc. So my job really was to be the host, to make sure the evening ran well. And that, as I said at the beginning of the evening, it was my job to take people around the location, tell them some of the history of the venue, and also some of the ghost stories associated with that place, sort of setting them up for later on in the evening when the medium would take over, and that's when the ghost hunting itself would actually take place.
I see. And do you have a favorite location that you felt was most active, where maybe a fair sum of guests would maybe feel something or see something, maybe a place with a tragic story?
Yeah, well, perhaps the most active place I've ever worked at would be Oxford Castle. As you can imagine, that's a really old medieval castle and older, and it has an underground crypt where bodies used to be stored during plague times. The bodies would be stored in this crypt underground and sort of piled half a dozen high. This crypt is underground, so when you switch off the lights, it's completely pitch black. There is absolutely no light at all. And as I worked for these ghost hunting companies. As they started to get to know me more, I progressed from just doing the history tours and the ghost tours to actually running the seances myself. Now, I've never been a medium. I don't have any mediumistic abilities, but I was able to run seances with the idea of saying to the guests, you tell me what you're picking up. We're going to have a seance, and I want you to, open up your mind, open up your own psychic abilities, and tell me what you're experiencing. And holding seances down in the crypt of Oxford Castle was always an amazing experience. We had people fainting, people vomiting, people running out of the place screaming, a place where you were guaranteed that your participants would have a paranormal experience down there, a really fascinating place.
Wow. And was it typical to maybe feel touched or hear a voice or whispers? What sort of stories surround Oxford Castle as far as maybe the employees and the people who've worked there for many years?
Well, often when the employees opened up for us and let us in, and they knew that we were the ghost hunting company, they would always have stories to tell us of their own experiences of being the last people in the building and having to switch out the lights and hearing voices, hearing footsteps, and knowing there was no one else in the building, and having to go to investigate just to make sure there were no guests still inside the building, and not being able to find anything. All of the employees who've been there for any amount of time always had stories they wanted to relay to us. From my own experience, in seances in general, my experience is that when you watch a Hollywood movie that has a seance, everybody experiences the same thing. Everybody goes, whoa, at the same time, and everybody sees the same apparition, etc. In reality, in the real world, when you hold a seance, everybody's experience tends to be different, and the experiences tend to be very personal. Some people will feel like there's somebody whispering in their ears. Another person may feel their hair being tugged. Another person may feel that they're being pushed, or they have hands on their shoulders, or they see a dark shadow in a corner. Everybody has their own individual experience. So rather than it being a group experience, it tends to be a number of individual experiences.
Wow. In the paranormal community, there's talk of what they call attachments, with the idea that a ghost might actually follow you home. Did you ever have any concern that what you were doing was about to maybe open some doors that couldn't be closed?
It was, in the early days, it was a concern that I had, because, of course, we all hear the urban myths and we've all seen the movies. And so that's always in the back of your head that something may follow you home. But I was working at an event one evening with a medium who was on a TV show in the UK called Most Haunted. You may have heard of it. And he was the guest of honor. And before he started doing the mediumistic demonstration, he asked if there were any questions. And one lady put her hand up and said, is there any danger of us taking anything home with us tonight? Is there any danger of a spirit attaching itself to us and going home with us at the end of the evening? And this medium, who was a slightly camp guy, said, there's been spirits here in this building for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And tonight, of all nights, they're going to follow you home. Get over yourself.
Right.
So once he said that, it sort of allayed my own fears. And then I talked to another medium, and they said, if you are worried when you're driving home at the end of the evening, just imagine there's a brick wall in your mind, and tell, whatever it is you're worried might be following you home, just tell it to go back, bugger off back to where it came from. Right. And that usually does the trick. Right.
I see. There's a YouTube clip out there going around on one of these channels I follow, and it's of a lady who participated in some sort of paranormal event, and she calls in complaining about her boyfriend being followed home by a ghost, and she was upset about the whole thing. So do you ever... you've heard, I guess we'll get into that. We'll talk a little bit more about seances in just a minute, right after we get back from this break.
You are listening to Spirits and More Radio. Have a paranormal story? Tell us at spooksandspirits.com.
No matter which way you go, no matter which way you stay, you're out of my mind, out of my mind, out of my mind, out of my mind. I was walking with the ghost. I said, please, please don't insist. I was walking with the ghost. I said, please, please don't insist. No matter which way you go, no matter which way you stay, you're out of my mind, out of my mind, out of my mind, out of my mind. I was walking with the ghost.
We are back with Mr. Paul Voodini, who has been in the field of paranormal for well over a decade, conducted ghost tours and seances. And I'd like to get a little bit more into the seance, Paul. As you mentioned in the movies, people have sort of a preconceived notion of what a seance is. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of seances, sort of maybe where they started and where they ended, and do they still go on?
Well, seances certainly still do go on, as anybody who goes on any sort of ghost hunting event will agree. But the history of seances really, I suppose, it goes back to the dawn of civilization, for the cavemen sitting around the campfire telling ghost stories and trying to scare each other. Humans have always wanted to communicate with spirits. They've always wondered what happens after death. They've always told each other stories. So I guess the whole notion of seances goes way back. Seances, as we probably understand them now, perhaps started with the Victorian spiritualists, which I'm sure many of your audience will be familiar with. Spiritualism really started in the mid-1800s with the Fox sisters, who came from upstate New York, and they were the first real mediums, as perhaps we would understand them in this day and age. They communicated with spirits via a series of bangs and knocks, what was referred to in the Victorian era as rappings, although of course these days rapping has a very different connotation. But in those days, it's the whole idea of where knock one for yes and two for no comes from the Fox sisters. They would ask questions of the spirits, and the spirits would reply by making knocking sounds. And from there, the whole spiritualist movement just blossomed and bloomed in the USA, in the UK, and for a short while on mainland Europe as well. So that's where seances, as we would understand them, started. There were some notable differences between the UK and the US. In the US, there was a strong tradition of what's known as physical mediumship. So in a seance, things would appear. Bunches of flowers would appear, fruit would appear on the table, gifts from the spirits would appear, and the spirits would wander amongst the sitters and shake hands with people who were attending the seance. In the UK, there's been a stronger tradition of trance mediumship, what's known as trance mediumship, where the medium goes into a trance and the spirits use their body as a vessel through which they can communicate with the sitters and pass on messages. So there have been some subtle differences depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. But yes, that would really, the Victorian spiritualism is really where seance, as we would understand it today, originated from.
Right. And it's interesting because if you think about this sort of thing today, there's seems to be two camps. You have people real serious about spiritualism and ghosts and spirits and mediumship. And then you have other people, maybe in our more modern world, that gravitate towards scientific type ideology. And one thing that I found fascinating was I had read that President Abraham Lincoln even had seances in the White House in 1859, I believe, right in that range. And that's pretty remarkable if you think about it. To think that that was happening so far up the social ladder as to in the presidential White House. Is there, when you conducted these seances, you must have been initially sort of on edge. I can imagine when one decides to go from sort of touring around and telling tales from the past to making that leap forward into now we're going to sit down and attempt to contact dead people. Did you have any apprehension initially?
Well, the first seance I experienced was I was working as the ghost tour host, and the organizer would say, you've done your bit now, you can go home if you wish, or you can sit in and experience a seance with the medium if you wish. And of course, I said, yes, I'd like to stay behind and I'd like to experience the seance, because up to that point, I'd only seen seances in movies, in TV shows, etc. And I imagined that I would be scared, that I would be apprehensive. But when the lights were turned off and we were sat in a circle around the table holding hands, I experienced this wonderful sense of peace really came over me, and I felt perfectly safe and protected and cocooned almost. So I have never during a seance felt actually scared or threatened myself. I know that people who have been the guests have sometimes felt very scared and very threatened, but personally speaking, I've always felt very safe in that environment, very sort of welcomed and very almost like a cocoon wrapped around me. And I find it a very soothing situation to be in, which may sound very strange, but I do find it a very soothing and peaceful environment.
Wow. That's interesting. I've never done an official seance or been involved in an official seance, although I will admit for the first time right here on this show that when the Powerball was at $1 billion, I did attempt to contact the dead and see if we could get any help, because $1 billion is quite a bit of money. Yeah. Unfortunately, what I learned is that when you pass on to the other side, apparently you have no psychic abilities as if you're here alive either. So unfortunately, my dead relatives were unable to produce the winning numbers, but one thing interesting, and call it coincidence, but I did do that routine or process, let's call it, 3 times. And all 3 times I got, I think, 4 out of the 6 numbers, which was interesting because it continued to let me get an additional ticket. So, but that is the only time that I've attempted to contact the dead, and with good cause too. But what sort of reactions do you get in these seances from people who come for an evening of entertainment and creepiness and fun, and what happens in there?
Well, it very much depends on the guests themselves. One thing I always used to say to the guests at the beginning of the evening is the more energy and the more enthusiasm you bring into the evening, the more you want things to happen, the more likely you are to have a paranormal experience. If you go into the evening sort of downbeat and looking at your watch and wondering when all this is going to be over, then people wouldn't have a paranormal experience. But the typical sort of reactions that people had would be they would feel people whispering in their ears, they would feel their hair being pulled, they would feel themselves being pushed. Some people would feel ill, they would feel nauseous. It was very common for women to feel the spirits of children holding their hands, brushing past their legs. And of course, we would have the shadows in the corner. We would hear footsteps walking around the table. So I have never seen an apparition. I've never seen a spirit form in front of a table, in the middle of the table, or in the room. But the experiences tend to be a lot more subtle than you would see perhaps in the movies, and a lot more personal. But they are very profound experiences. Even just feeling somebody whispering in your ear is a very profound experience for somebody to have, and it would not be unusual for people to break down in tears after having these small little individual experiences.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what the listeners need to remember, if you've never experienced a paranormal event, they aren't really these sort of grand experiences like in the movies. They are as simple as someone whispering in your ear, which, as you said, just that alone is really something profound for the person who's experiencing it, because to hear something whisper, my wife actually had, and my daughter, both of them, have heard somebody say "hey" directly into their ear here at the house we live in. And my wife actually thought it was myself. And she turned around the other way and sort of saw what she thought was me move towards the hallway. And then I came in from the other direction, and she realized it wasn't me. But when people have these experiences sort of in a same location and unprovoked, that is, I think, some of the ones that you never forget, your first time that you have this unprovoked experience where it's not on top of mind, you're not out hunting for it, you're not looking for it. It's just this event happens to you, and you realize that there's no other explanation for these sort of things to happen. So I think that's interesting. Tell me about some of the old seance things that would go, instruments being played, tambourines and things like that. Was that a part of the seances that you were involved with?
No, I mean, the whole thing with the tambourines being thrown across the room and flowers materializing on in the middle of tables was very much part of the Victorian spiritualism. And as I'm sure all of your listeners will be aware, and I'm sure you're very much aware, there was an awful lot of fraud that went on with Victorian spiritualist movement. The seances that I ran were completely genuine, nothing, no trickery, nothing set up. We would just simply sit in a circle holding hands and would invite spirits to interact with us or communicate with us in any way that they felt able to. So we didn't have, the great experiences of tambourines flying across the room, or doors banging, or spirits walking around the table shaking hands with the sitters. It was just a genuine attempt to communicate with the spirits, and we never expected to get the huge, the group experience when something amazing happens. I always like to tell the guests at the beginning of the evening to manage your expectations. Forget what you know about what you've read about in books. Forget what you've seen in movies. This will be a very almost low-key experience, but the fact that it's a low-key experience almost makes it more profound than if there was a tambourine flying across the room, if that makes sense. Right, absolutely.
What is this idea, and you might know more about this than I do, there's talk of, you hear of mirrors being sort of a portal to the other side. Are mirrors within a seance room, and I hear the term black mirror. Do you know anything about that?
I've used ordinary mirrors in the seance room. We used to have two types of seance. We have the seance in a location where the guests would sit round a table together and hold hands. But of course, when you're talking about old stately homes and castles, not everywhere has a large table and a nicely set out where your guests can sit around and hold hands. So we would have what we used to call vigils, which is almost like a standing up seance. Exactly the same. You would stand in a circle, hold hands, and run it in the same way as a seance, but you just weren't sat down, you were standing up. And in that kind of location, in that kind of environment, you can start to introduce other elements such as pendulums. You can hand pendulums out. We used to do some what we call glass moving, which is like the Ouija board but set out on a table. And also we used to use mirrors, and I would ask some guests to go into a corner of the room, turn their back to us, but hold the mirror up and see us in the mirror and explain what they can see. And very often they would see shadows moving amongst us, they would see figures moving amongst us, and then when they turned back around, those shadows and those figures would be gone. And it was only when they were looking at us via the mirror that they would pick up on this spirit activity.
Wow, That is really something. Were there ever any times when things almost sort of seemed like they were spiraling out of control, where maybe you felt like the events happening were maybe harmful emotionally or getting dangerous, someone potentially have a heart attack or faint, as you say? Did that happen frequently, and how did you handle that?
It didn't happen frequently, but one occasion does spring to mind when I was working at Oxford Castle. As I've already explained, they have the underground crypt where there's no light at all. And I do remember one event there where people were fainting left, right, and centre. People were having to run out to be sick. People were in tears. And there was a time when I thought, dear me, this is getting out of hand. I can't control all this. And ultimately what we had to do was turn the lights on and just gather our thoughts, have a breather, have a coffee break, go outside, get some fresh air, discuss what we'd experienced before we started doing the seance again. I literally had 2 or 3 people fainting at the same time. I remember a woman running out because she needed to vomit. There were people crying. And that was the only time when I started to feel I was losing a bit of control over events. And at that time, I just said time out and, put the lights on and said, look, let's get out of here. Let's just go and get a coffee and talk about what we've been experiencing.
Right. That's unbelievable. We're going to take a little break. We are talking with Paul Voudini, seance host and ghost tour guide for over a decade. Remember, you can call into the show at 1-872-GHOSTS if you have any questions for Paul. And if you call while you're listening to a replay of the show, you can leave a voicemail with your terrifying tale.
And now it's time for Haunted Places.
The Rentlaw Plaza Hotel, located near the University of Wisconsin, opened in 1922. Numerous guest reports of paranormal activity have persisted over the years, leading to a reputation of being haunted. It's said that hotel staff have even warned some guests of haunted rooms on the 7th floor and of a ghost named Walter, believed to be Walter Schroeder, owner of the hotel until he died in 1967. It's not uncommon for guests to hear footsteps in rooms and hallways when they are all alone. More terrifying are multiple accounts from guests waking up to something tapping or touching them, and worse, being held down. One man said, "I woke up to someone whispering in my ear and then felt a hand on my chest that held me down for what felt like an eternity." Another guest saw her bathroom light turn on and off several times after feeling something touch her back and shoulder. The Rentlaw is an old hotel and soon will undergo major renovation. The question is, will its ghost stay or go? Many have no doubt its spirits will continue to haunt guests and employees alike. Well, Paul, the Rentlaw, I've never been there myself, but I did travel to Atlanta, and while I was in Atlanta, I checked into a boutique hotel, and this is one of these really old buildings that's been converted into an upscale sort of hip hotel where they play, modern music, and it has a party vibe, and it's completely renovated into something really spectacular. And it's interesting because in this sort of fun, exciting modern environment, we walked with our bags into the elevator, and we started to go up the floors, and this sort of creepy feeling just came across me at the time. And I remember the doors opening and looking down the halls, and they were very dark hallways, which was unusual, but I suppose part of their idea for a intimate mood type of environment. But what was different about that hotel is that it sort of had this evil vibe to it, which is significantly different than a haunted, I feel like I could see a ghost in this old cabin vibe, which I've experienced as well. So it was interesting because my travel partner at the time, and now my wife, also made a comment about feeling uneasy in this hotel and also sort of feeling the evil vibe, which I think is interesting, that there's this idea of sort of evil entities versus ghosts and spirits. Have you felt anything on your travels around the world in hotels?
Not in a hotel, but I did run a weekend event in a village near where I live called Castleton, which is in Derbyshire in England. And Castleton is a small village, perhaps a couple of thousand people live there, but it still very much has a very sort of oldie worldy vibe to it. All of the houses are sort of stone built cottages, and the roads are still sort of paved with stones, and the people who live there still leave little piles of money on their doorstep, and the idea with that is to buy the favour of the fairies. There's still a deep-seated belief in the fairies and fairy folk and fair folk in this very rural area, so they still leave piles of coins on their doorstep to buy the favour of fairies. And the backs of the houses look out onto these dark moors, and all of the windows have crucifixes at them facing out onto the moors. So it's still a place full of superstitions and tradition, and people sort of cling to the old ways. And we were running an event over 2 nights in an old cottage. There was actually a youth hostel. Its day job, as it were, was as a youth hostel. And I was working there on the Friday night and the Saturday night. On the Friday night at about 3 o'clock in the morning, the event finished and all of the guests left. And the event organizer said to me, look, it's a youth hostel, there's loads of beds. Rather than having to drive home at 3 o'clock in the morning, why don't you just stay over in one of the bedrooms, choose your own bedroom, and then in the morning you can get up, you can use the kitchen, etc. So I thought this was a great idea. Said goodbye to all the guests. I went and found a room, closed the door, got into bed. I knew there was nobody else in the venue, and I suddenly heard children laughing and giggling out in the corridor, and heard footsteps running up and down the corridor. And I knew for a fact, A, there was nobody in the building, and B, there were certainly no children in the building. And so I was quite terrified. I was sat in bed with the sheets up against my chin, not daring to move. And then suddenly there was a knock on the door, on the bedroom door that I'd closed. And I laid in that bed, not daring to move. And it was probably an hour or two later when I started to nod off to sleep, fell asleep, woke up with a start. It was the morning, the sun was out, it was a beautiful morning. I opened up the doorway, the corridor was empty, and to this day, I still don't know whether that was a paranormal experience or whether I'd fallen asleep and dreamt it.
Right. I think that it's interesting because some people, and I had a very profound experience in 2012, which at some point I will reveal on this show, not this show, but I found that my mind was wanting to justify what I had experienced and very desperately hunting for explanation. And I think that's just a matter of maybe human nature, that we're almost programmed to believe that this can't be true, it doesn't make sense, it's not logical. And so therefore we sort of hide under the sheets and hope that it's not. But, what's interesting is there are so many reports, numerous people. I find that if you open up to someone and you start to tell your stories and experiences, that oftentimes people feel comfortable enough to share with you something that's happened to them that they found profound, and that they may naturally not tell somebody just for fear of being thought of as maybe a lunatic or a little bit off. So the more I sort of meet people and start to talk about the paranormal, I find that there are a lot of stories out there. Do you have a favorite story of all time that really stands out in your mind with regard to ghosts and the paranormal?
I've just recalled that at the beginning of the show you said, can you recount your first paranormal experience? And I told the story of the UFO that I saw. That was one of the first, but actually I forgot to mention that when I was about 14 or 15, and this for a long time was my standard ghost story, my first experience with an actual ghost. I was with a friend of mine, as I said, I was about 14 or 15 years old, and we were walking up the driveway of a large house near where I live. I live out in the suburbs, and some of the houses are quite big, and they have a long driveway with a big lawn on at the front, surrounded by trees. And we were walking up this driveway. I can't remember exactly why we were doing that. I don't know if we were trick or treating or something like that, but we were walking up the driveway to this house, and on our left was a large lawn. And suddenly, in the middle of the lawn, we saw this ball of light floating about 3 feet off the ground, about the size of a tennis ball, perhaps. And me and my friend both stopped. We tapped each other and pointed to it, and we were staring at it, trying to figure out what it was. And suddenly, this ball of light spun around and started shooting light all around the garden. And the garden was surrounded on all sides by trees, and so this light was shooting around the garden, and then slowly it came together and made the image of a bride floating again about 3 feet off the floor. And it was an absolutely perfect rendition of a bride. You could see the folds of her dress, you could see her veil, but you could still see through her. She was translucent. You could see the trees on the other side of the garden through her. And I remember being absolutely scared stiff. People talk about being scared stiff, frozen solid, unable to move. And believe you me, I was. My mind was saying, run, run, but my body had just locked, was just frozen. And after about 5-10 seconds, this bride again turned into these lights swirling around the garden and then just disappeared. And me and my friend turned around and just ran and ran and ran, and we must have ran for 10 minutes until we stopped through pure exhaustion and then walked home. And the interesting thing is that neither of us talked about it after that. We just said goodnight to each other and went to our respective homes, and we never mentioned what we'd seen to each other.
Right, I can imagine. Boy, that's an amazing sight. I can't imagine seeing that with my own eyes. I did see something that I thought was very bizarre, and this sort of goes back to ghost tours. Oftentimes, it sounds like there in England, the tours are really centered around one location. Here in the United States, a lot of the ghost tours are sort of walking tours through an urban city, where the tour guide will sort of point here and point there and tell some stories about specific hotels or locations. But one place that ghost tours don't seem to happen frequently, at least that I'm aware of, is in forests. And I once lived near it. It wasn't truly a forest. It was more of a canyon here. We don't have large forests in Southern California. But I lived near an area known as Elfin Forest, and it's has several rumored hauntings, a woman on a white horse and so forth. And there actually is a spiritualist camp located in this particular area. And it's a very rural road, very dark, very sparse, not too many homes, although that's changing. But at the time, my home was on the other side of this, and I had to drive that road daily And I hadn't ever really seen anything unusual until one particular night. What's important is that the children were in school at this time, so it wasn't the summer, and I had worked really late on a particular job I was on. Coming home, I believe it was about 1 a.m, and as I drove on this dark rural road, halfway through up ahead, I noticed people, and these people were kids, I would say between 7 and 13 years old, and probably about 10 to 15 of them. And as I drove up, I thought it was very strange that they were out there on a school night on a Wednesday so late, and they didn't have any flashlights on. So I was only seeing them because of my car's headlights as I was approaching. And of course, I was a little bit nervous in the fact that what are they doing there? And I hope they don't step out in front of my car, because there's a bunch of them. And as I approached them, they were all lined up in a row on the side of the road, looking towards me as I passed. And I vividly recall looking in my rearview mirror and seeing the bunch of them lit up in red from my taillights, still looking at me drive away. And the one thing I noticed was there were no other vehicles around, or adults. So it wasn't as if it was some sort of astronomy tour or something like that. So that's the only strange thing I've experienced out there. But have you done anything? Are there any tales from forests in your area, or legends centered around things out in the forest?
Yeah, near where I live, actually, there's it's more of a woods than a forest. It's not perhaps not as large and as grand as a forest, but it's certainly quite a dense woods. And during the World War One, there's an area within the woods that was used as a training camp for soldiers that were going off to fight in France during World War One, and this was a Sheffield battalion. And when they went over to France, their first battle that they were involved with was a Battle of the Somme. And within 24 hours of arriving in France, 3/4 of these young men were dead. They were wiped out. And so the area where these guys trained is regarded locally as a very haunted area. People see soldiers walking through the trees. The spirit lights have been seen, flickering lights dashing between the trees. And it's a very, very spooky place that you certainly wouldn't want to venture into after dark.
Right. And I think that would be an excellent place for a ghost tour.
Yes.
As opposed to the urban area, which is really loud. It's interesting because you think about places where there's maybe tragedy that happens and unexpected death, where the idea is that these spirits or ghosts maybe don't know that they're dead and they're still here roaming around. But you never hear about people talking about modern day hospitals where death happens frequently. Maybe old hospitals and institutions, but you don't hear about let's go ghost hunting through the halls of the local medical offices.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you faded out for a few seconds.
Okay. So is there, in all the time that you've done this, it sounds like you're really not afraid of the spirit world or anything of that sort. Do you have any recommendations for people maybe who want to explore further what they can sort of try? You mentioned these pendulums and Ouija boards and so forth. As a matter of fact, there's a hotel I just saw that has the world record for the largest Ouija board. It's on the top of a hotel that's supposedly very haunted on the east coast of the United States. That's on our website. You can go ahead to spiritsandmoreradio.com and click onto the video to have a look at that. But is there any sort of warnings to people, or do you feel like Ouija boards and pendulums are a safe thing to explore with?
I would certainly say that pendulums are reasonably safe. You can use a pendulum to ask very basic yes and no questions of spirits. The idea is that you hold a pendulum in your hand and ask the spirits to let you know that they're there by making the pendulum move, and then you can ask very rudimentary yes and no questions, and by the response of the pendulum moving, get an answer. When it comes to Ouija boards, that's a very contentious subject, a very multi-layered subject to get into. My personal feeling is that Ouija boards have been given a bad press, really, thanks to Hollywood and urban myths and stories that people tell each other about things that have supposedly happened to a friend of a friend who've used a Ouija board. But I would say that the danger that lies with Ouija boards is that sense of expectation that people have, that they've heard the urban myths, they've seen the movies, they know that bad things happen, or they think they know that bad things happen after you've used a Ouija board, and so they almost invite it in. They almost expect that dark energy to come in, and they expect bad things to happen. So I would say Ouija boards are, in and of themselves, are not a dangerous object, they're not a dark object, but what can bring in that dark energy is when people expect bad things to happen, and they almost invite that dark energy in. So I would certainly advise people away from using Ouija boards unless they know that they're going into it with a completely open mind, and it might sound a little bit twee and a little bit I don't know, but as long as they're going into it with a good heart and with love and respect, rather than doing it as a dare or something that they'll do after a few bottles of wine and sort of egg each other on to do. That's the wrong way to approach it. So I would say pendulums are fine to experiment with, taking a first step into the world of spirit communication, but Ouija boards need to be handled a little bit more delicately and not to be taken lightly.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've all heard tales of sinister things with Ouija boards. We'll be right back after this.
Spirits and More Radio. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day. Try to run, try to hide, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, yeah.
We're back. Don't be afraid.
We are back with Mr. Paul Voudini, who is approximately 5,000 miles away from me in Southern California. Paul, so you've sort of transitioned recently to writing, I understand.
That's right. I've always been in love with writing and with books. One of my first sort of introductions almost to the world of the paranormal and the supernatural is via reading the old Victorian novels such as Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, etc., and also a lot of American comics, Marvel, DC comics, and Tales from the Crypt, etc. So I've always been in love with writing and with books, and so recently I've been writing books about an alternative Victorian London populated by vampires and all sorts of demons and monsters, which is a lot of fun to write and hopefully a lot of fun to read as well.
Wow. So you've already written, how many books have you written?
I've got one book available on Amazon called Dolly Biters. Dolly Biters is supposed to be in my alternative London of the Victorian era. It's the name that the Londoners used to call female vampires. So that's already available on Amazon. I'm running a Kickstarter campaign at the moment to fund my next book, which has a title of A London Gothic. So once again, it's set in Victorian London and involves vampires and witches and demons and all of the good stuff. And so if anybody was interested in that, if they went to Kickstarter and just did a search either for my name or London Gothic, then I'm sure they would find the appropriate page.
Right. And now, do those two books tie together? Are they sort of separate?
They're standalone, but they're set in a very similar universe, a very similar alternative Victorian London. The idea being that vampires were real in that era, and that they were eventually destroyed by the human population and sort of written out of the history books and almost forgotten about. But the idea is that in Victorian London and in the Victorian era in general, vampires were a thing.
And I know, it's interesting, and we're really short on time, but I understand that the whole vampire folklore, at least, this was probably a decade or two ago now, groups of people would sort of congregate, and I know it happened in London and New York and so forth, San Francisco. Groups of people would get together and sort of play these urban vampire games and have clans of vampires and move about the city at night and do that sort of thing. Did you ever hear about that?
Yes, there's still a lot of role-playing groups out there that do that. They have their vampire character, their vampire identity, and they sort of operate in clans and in hierarchies, and they sort of have this whole role-playing thing going on. And of course, in London in the 1970s, there was the Highgate Cemetery vampire scandal, when it was claimed that there was a vampire in Highgate Cemetery, and so the place was besieged with vampire hunters and paranormal investigators to such a degree now that Highgate Cemetery won't allow any kind of paranormal groups or ghost hunts to take place within their grounds.
That's very interesting. I often wonder, people who sort of move into that world of role play and vampires would be the perfect trap for a real vampire to sort of find their victims, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. They could hide in plain sight. Right.
Just stand over here and we're going to pretend like we're going to bite your neck. And this isn't really your blood, but it is, So, Paul, it was a pleasure. It was very interesting. I think people are going to love listening to this radio show. And there's so much more to talk about. Maybe we'll do it again. Again, visit Paul's, look for Paul Voodini on Facebook. That's where you do a lot of your broadcasting of what you're up to and what's happening. The book sounds fascinating. I'd love to get a copy and read that. Thank you for listening to Spirits and More Radio. We will be back for another edition in a few weeks, and stick around. Go to the website, Spirits and More Radio, where you can sort of sign up to the podcast. You can call in again at 1-872-2-GHOST and leave your paranormal experiences with us, and we'll get you on the air. Thank you, Paul. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Spirits and More Radio was a 3K Media production.
Then waited all night for the walls to move. I've loved some girls that I barely knew. I've made some friends and I've lost some too. Crashed my car, I was 17. My mother in the seat riding next to me. The things I've learned from a broken mirror, how a face can change when a heart knows fear. For all the things my eyes have seen, the best by far is you. If I could fly, then I would know what life looks like from up above and down below. I keep you safe, I keep you dry. Don't be afraid, Cecilia, I'm the satellite, and you're the sky.